Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. And this morning, we're really delighted to be hosting Jason Arterburn from the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, more popularly known by its great acronym, C4ADS. This morning, we're here to for Jason to launch their newest excellent report entitled Party Capital, a Blueprint for National Security Due Diligence on China. And as Jason will explore, party capital is not referring to Gainesville, Florida, or any other party capital around the United States, but in fact, this incredibly important phenomenon of China's evolving political economy, or what we might call state capitalism in China, which Jason and a number of other researchers around the world are beginning to hone in on the role of the Communist Party and how it is increasingly integrated into overseeing and channeling capital in ways that are strategic and significant in terms of their impact on market economies around the world, not least of which the United States is an important example. I think other scholars have been grappling with this critical question of even as we diagnose that China's economic and political system is evolving into a more hybrid state party capitalist system, what do we do about it? For those who want to keep the United States economy integrated with China in important ways, coming up with mechanisms by which we can protect national security and our own economic interests will become of critical importance. So Jason has researched and written, I think, a really compelling document that pushes us in an important new direction about the tools that we can forge and fashion using open source information so that we begin taking this step towards a more proactive approach of protecting our own interests while remaining integrated in important ways with China. We only have 45 minutes today, so I'd like to get right into the conversation. I'm going to turn it over in a minute to Jason, who will walk us through the top line takeaways from the report, as well as get into some of the methodological approaches, as well as some of the recommendations that Jason and his comrades over at C4ADS have. As a reminder, this is a participatory mass democracy event, so folks are encouraged to send in questions. You can do so by going to csis.org, and then on the event page or in the events page, you will see a listing for this event, and click the box and please send your question at any time. I will try to integrate these after Jason makes his opening remarks. So with that, Jason, let me turn it over to you, and thanks again for joining us this morning.
Great. All right, well, thanks, Jude, for inviting me to speak today, and thanks to the rest of the crew at CSIS for putting on this great event. It's a privilege to be here. So today, as Jude mentioned, I'd really like to discuss an area of vital importance to national security, and one that I believe that with the right approaches, we could be much better prepared to address. And that is how the Chinese party state interacts with the commercial sector, and how we can use new forms of data to make sense of it. Now, at C4ADS today, as Jude noted, we released a new report on this topic called Party Capital. I'd encourage everyone to go to our website and give it a look, but it really reflects the work that we've been doing on this topic over several years and where we hope to take it forward in the years to come. Now, in the very recent past, there's been a significant amount of research on the key companies, universities, institutions, and government offices that are driving changes in China's state capitalist system. and on how the Chinese party state has used those enterprises to deliberately pursue national security interests around the world. In my report and in the discussion today, I'd like to complement this work about what we know about China's political economy with what we know about the data that is available in the open source. My goal here is to outline and draw attention to the ways that China's party state apparatus leaves a data footprint in its interactions with the economy, and on how the United States and allies can use that data footprint to their advantage. So specifically, I'd like to focus my remarks today on two key points. The first point is that China's economy is complex, diversified, and politicized, which makes it hard, but not impossible, to contextualize the relationship of any given company to the Chinese state. The second point is that there is so much publicly available information out there today that can help us to do so, and it should be a central component of our approach to meeting the challenge of Chinese state capitalism. Now, to emphasize that point, there is a tremendous and growing amount of data in the unclassified space that serves a really banal commercial purpose, whether it's helping businesses pay taxes, investors to analyze market trends, or ships to avoid collisions in the open ocean. But that data has a national security valence too, and because it can be collected cheaply, at scale, and without classification restrictions, it can do a lot to help coordinate the growing range of stakeholders who are looking to identify and mitigate risk. So let's start with my first point. China's economy is complex, diversified, and politicized. And as a result, it's difficult to understand the relationship of any given company to the party state. Now, as many may already be familiar, because China has weak formal market institutions, Chinese companies have relied on special deals with local governments in order to survive, compete, and grow in the domestic market. Scholars have described the special deal system as such. So local governments who seek political achievements compete with other local governments to attract businesses to their region. To do so, they create preferential and protectionist policies to provide access to capital. Private enterprises accept special deals with local governments because they provide market protections that don't otherwise exist. As those companies grow and pursue access in other regions, they create new deals with other local governments. Now, over 3 decades, this special deal system of public and private collusion has been one of the main driving forces behind China's growth. But as Chinese companies pursue globalization, it creates 2 serious national security consequences for the United States and for other liberal democracies with similar market-oriented economies. The first, China's special deal system has given rise to massive, sprawling networks of companies with complex relationships to the state at many different levels of governance. In fact, according to one study, the average size of the largest 100 conglomerates in China has increased from 500 companies in 1995 to more than 15,000 companies in 2015. And as a result, it is now difficult through equity ownership analysis alone to determine who ultimately controls a company, or to understand how different companies relate to each other within these massive conglomerates. Those conglomerates may also operate in a broad range of industries. My favorite example, China Poly Group, it's a state-owned enterprise whose subsidiary Poly Technologies is on the Commerce Department's entity list for weapons proliferation. Now, China Poly Group also has another subsidiary, Polyculture, that trades in art and antiquities and maintains one of the largest art auction houses in the world. So if that doesn't give you a sense for the diversity of operations of these companies, there are many other fun examples out there to consider. Now, the second national security consequence is that private enterprises in China face financial incentives to work closely with state owners and investors, which may lead to political exposure or entanglements whose national security implications are really difficult to assess. So using corporate registration data, researchers at the University of Chicago assessed that while privately held capital China has grown significantly as a proportion of China's economy over the last 2 decades, it has only done so for private investors who are proximate to the state in their commercial ventures. So these findings suggest that while the party state may not directly control private investors, successful private investors may have varying degrees of political exposure, which may or may not ultimately pose a national security risk. As a result of these political features, Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School has described Chinese business systems as mafia-like, in part because Chinese businesses can ensure growth and survival only through relations of mutual endangerment with political elites and by manipulating the financial system in their favor. So in this complex, diversified, and politicized commercial environment, we really face 2 key challenges in our effort to understand and mitigate national security risk. And the first is diagnostic, namely in how we define the threat. We need to determine how exactly the party state relates to the commercial enterprises or research institutes, and under what conditions the party state can and cannot instrumentalize those enterprises to pursue its national security objectives. The second is prescriptive, or in how we develop a policy response. If we are indeed able to determine how a commercial enterprise relates to the party state, we need to be able to determine what policy response is most appropriate, given the nature of risk on a case-by-case basis. So let's first start with that diagnostic challenge of putting a firm's relationship to the state in context. In my report, I describe the party state's interactions in the economy in 5 somewhat crude buckets. So the first is commercial, using state-owned enterprises and their vast networks of subsidiaries to advance desired policy objectives at home and abroad, or using regulators with broad authorities to tilt the commercial environment toward favored enterprises. And the second is financial, gatekeeping access to capital through state-owned financial institutions, government-guided investment funds, or strict capital controls. Now, a lot of this is pretty similar to fiscal policy mechanisms in the United States or elsewhere, but it's a really important lever in the party state's toolkit for economic statecraft. Now, the third, on the academic front, encouraging universities to use massive investment vehicles or other financial inducements to attract talent, acquire technology, and commercialize it domestically, including pumping significant amounts of revenue into professors' ventures and helping them get quickly to IPO. Now, fourth, on the social side, conferring prestige to business elites through membership in former political institutions that incentivize alignment with party state priorities. These are things like the CPPCC, or China's People's Political Consultative Conference, which has a national body and analogs at the provincial levels, which are subordinate to the United Front Work Department and intended to capture elites across various segments of society. And fifth, mobilizing political committees and industrial associations as extra legal mechanisms for corporate governance and oversight, and using expansive laws to threaten and compel the party state's policy line through the legal system. Now, understanding these mechanisms in party state's toolkit for economic engagement is useful because it gives us clues where to look for the party state's data footprint. So I'll say that differently. This background about how the party state engages the economy gives us a sense for where we can find the information we need to understand a company's relationship to the state along all of these different lines that are formal and informal. So let's unpack that a bit. On the commercial side, we can use corporate registry filings to map state-owned enterprises, their subsidiaries, their shareholders and directors, and other affiliated companies. In our report and the beta phase of our ongoing project, we've identified more than 34,000 companies and around 8,000 affiliated shareholders and directors within several degrees of the central managing authority for the central national state-owned enterprises. This data exists in the public domain to help the Chinese economy function. Investors need to know about a company, its financial solvency, and its officers if they were ever to be expected to put money into it. But those corporate filings can then also be useful for our interest as well. Now, on the financial side, we can use corporate registry filings and private equity data to identify government-guided investment funds, publicly traded companies, state-owned financial institutions, and even more niche and informal financial brokers like casinos and junket operators who are licensed to do a pretty sensitive business in China and abroad. So this data can give us a sense for how state money, or party capital, if you will, is moving across the economy, and how different state fiscal mechanisms may be directing their resources in a coordinated fashion, whether that's into investments in strategic sectors, or perhaps in more illicit money laundering activities. Now, on the academic side, we can use bibliographic information from academic research papers, patent data, and other forms of research-related products to understand research activity and quality in key technological areas of interest, whether that's domestically or internationally. We can similarly use corporate data to map expansive corporate networks of universities and their holding companies, which direct significant amounts of capital into joint ventures with state-owned enterprises and into professor startups to commercialize technology. Now, we already know broadly what technology China's leaders want to develop and commercialize, but these data sources can tell us which specific players they're counting on to actually make it happen. Now, on the social front, we can use official government resume data, judicial records, academic research, and news reporting to build a data set on the political bodies that Chinese government uses to capture influential elites from different segments of society. We can also use Mandarin language reporting and third-party aggregators like Dow Jones or Refinitiv to enrich this information with relatives and close associates that may be used on corporate filings to hide a company's association to politically exposed persons. And finally, on the political front, we can use similar disclosure documents and news reporting to build data sets of civil society organizations that are registered to key political bodies of interest. So after this laundry list, you're probably thinking, all right, Jason, I get it. You've collected a whole lot of data. Why do I care? And from my perspective, the key point here is that when you collect data at high scale in a way that is not indiscriminate, but rather informed by how we know the party state interacts with the economy, you can start to make more proactive, data-driven risk assessments, and in turn, make more proactive risk mitigation measures and policy. So to put that in more concrete terms, let's take the example of Pan Jianwei and China's quantum science ambitions. So Pan Jianwei is one of China's leading quantum scientists based at the University of Science and Technology of China, and he has been called the father of quantum for his work. Now, some of you may be familiar with him because he came on the radar for many China watchers after he developed the first international quantum communications network through collaboration with the university in Austria. And then again last summer, when a company that he helped start called Quantum CTech had seed funding originally from the state, but then last summer had a big IPO on Shanghai's Star Market. Now, in recent years, some have reported how his lab drew heavily on talent trained overseas and on international partnerships in order to help China make this big leap in the quantum space. But one question should come to mind for us, and that is, could we have known about this lab sooner, particularly outside of the quantum research community that surely knows about a prominent researcher, but may not be thinking as much about the national security implications? And similarly, do we know who the next Pan Jianwei of semiconductors or biotechnology is? And do we know which one of her ventures will be the next state-preferred firm that goes public and enriches researchers in the process and starts redirecting that capital towards SOEs that we may already care about and be concerned about? So to answer that question, let's see what we could have known from public records related to Pan Jianwei and his research well before the company went public. So first, we know from university websites, government news releases, and corporate registry documents that Pan Jianwei and several co-founders of Quantum CTech are affiliates of prominent defense labs and inter-university consortia involved in the research and development of quantum technology. And those programs were founded on the back of national policy decisions related to investments in technology, in some cases nearly a decade ago. Second, we know that their company's earliest investors were the university's holding company, which provided seed funding, and a Chinese sovereign wealth fund affiliated with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which provided initial funding until the company became profitable. Those two companies still hold some of the most significant stakes in Quantum CTech after its IPO last summer, which also did a lot to enrich the professors who founded it. To give you a sense for what that meant for those professors, Pan Jianwei's stake in the company reportedly rose to $34 million after the company went public. Third, we know again from government news releases and corporate records that Pan and several co-founders who hold concurrent positions as professors at universities have received significant state recognition, hold direct equity stakes in the now public company, and have also held those stakes since as early as 2009 when the company was founded. Fourth, we know that some of the researchers with equity stakes work at other universities with explicit defense ties, like Beihang University, which is one of the 7 sons of national defense, and also at other lesser-known research centers. In some cases, we also know that the company's directors and shareholders work at technology transfer centers at their universities. And finally, we know that Quantum CTech now redirects its significant capital to many joint ventures it operates with state-owned enterprises and other research centers, including those that have been designated as national security threats by the US government, whether that's the Department of Treasury or the Federal Communications Commission. So clearly, publicly available information can do a lot to tell us pretty granular information about the networks of people, companies, universities, and state infrastructure that are assisting China's national security interests. If we get better at using that publicly available information, we can move to a more proactive posture in how we diagnose risk in the commercial sector and how we prescribe policy to mitigate that risk. Now, in some cases, that policy might be punitive and outwardly focused, like the use of government designations to prohibit U.S. entities from providing certain goods and services to military end users and the like. I think that many in the national security space are already thinking quite a lot about those measures. But in other cases, those policies might be defensive and inwardly focused, like making sure our forthcoming National Beneficial Ownership Registry gives us the information we need to do appropriate due diligence on companies that are China domiciled, or that we ask the right questions in disclosure documents to fill gaps in information that we can't already know for ourselves from what's out there. So if we get this right, we can start to produce more actionable reporting that is unclassified and can therefore be shared more easily with stakeholders like university administrators or state and local governments who are really on the front lines of exposure to these issues and therefore central to any strategy we have to mitigate the risks. Now, while this report demonstrates a significant potential of using open source information to respond from threats from China, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the potential for its perils as well, perhaps best illustrated by the recent trial of Dr. Ming Hu, a former University of Tennessee at Knoxville professor who faced trial in June of this year for being accused of being a spy. In the course of his trial, federal agents admitted to falsely accusing Hu of being a Chinese spy based on a rough translation of a Mandarin language flyer identified in a Google search, which began a multi-year economic espionage probe. Now, these charges have since been dropped, but the professor's life has been significantly affected as a result of these charges based on basic open source information, which highlights that there are many complexities to consider when using open source in the intelligence enterprise that I'd like to explicitly call out. So the first is that while open source information may be low cost and easy to access, the methods for its use and exploitation are not necessarily straightforward. Any broader adoption of open source information must be accompanied by rigorous analytic and ethical standards, many of which may be unaddressed by compliance frameworks designed primarily for classified information. The second is that investigations on threats from China require subject matter expertise, which includes both the discernment and linguistic skills to not only find relevant data, but also to set it in appropriate context. Now, the data used in this report is predominantly from Mandarin language sources. And while new technology platforms dramatically reduce the technical threshold required for subject matter experts to access and exploit data, they must understand the proper context for the data that they're using in order to create an analytically rigorous product. And the third and final implication is that the long-term success of efforts to counter national security threats from China requires credibility and confidence in the process and approach. And as government efforts to counter threats from China are increasingly subject to public scrutiny, a more effective use of unclassified sources can be a powerful tool to build confidence and facilitate collaboration between the diverse range of stakeholders, especially non-traditional ones, that are necessary for protecting and advancing the national interest. Now, in any case, as China's economy continues to grow and globalize, policymakers and regulators in the United States and allied countries will continue to face challenges not only in appraising where the potential cost of engagement with Chinese business systems may outweigh the benefits, but also in responding to an ever-broadening range of commercial activities that prompt national security concerns, whether that's technology transfers that erode U.S. economic and military advantages, illicit financial flows that undermine non-proliferation efforts, the deployment of fishing vessels and sand dredgers to assert territorial claims, or international exposure to China's grievous human rights abuses in Xinjiang and around the world. Now, fundamentally, these risks boil down to whether or not the party state can successfully make a commercial actor, university, or civil society organization do its bidding. In the 2020 China Deep Dive report, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence found that absent a significant realignment of resources, the U.S. government and intelligence community will fail to achieve the outcomes required to enable continued U.S. competition with China. And I hope that this work is only the start of a broader conversation about how we can move in that direction. Thank you.
Jason, that was fantastic. And a lot to chew on there, and really appreciate that. We've already got questions coming in, but if I can take moderator's prerogative here, I wanted to ask a question about, given, having read the report and heard your remarks, and I'm curious if there is a way, given the complexity, as you say, and the politicization of China's economy, would it be possible for a private Chinese firm to demonstratively prove it's private? In other words, there's a growing discussion about requiring companies to essentially prove their distance from the state. But in a negative sense, could they do that, and what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think, my initial response is that given the nature of China's political economy, who really cares at the end of the day if it's private or if it's state-owned? I think the question we need to be asking of companies is, what are the set of national security risks that this company could pose in its commercial behavior that it's pursuing, whether that's an investment or a trade partnership or an academic collaboration? And what types of or how can we take steps to mitigate that risk proactively? I think we've seen, over the last year with tech companies or education tech companies, private companies may still end up subject to extreme regulatory pressures that completely change the risks that they expose to international partners and investors. And so I think having a laser focus on state-owned versus private, I think misses maybe the more important question about what are sort of the set of ways in which a company, if it were ultimately to end up under the scrutiny of the party state, might end up exposing us to risk, and what can we do to mitigate it. So I think, in my report, I go through some indicators that I think are important in considering these, whether, across the board, no matter what issue you care about most. So certain things are like goal compatibility that a company might have in its commercial activities. Are the commercial activities it's pursuing abroad consistent with what the party state wants to achieve, which may inform how it relates to the party state, a relationship of enablement versus one of more coercive or regulatory measures. Another one might be market structure. To what extent is a company dependent on access to the Chinese market and therefore regulatory blessing in order to maintain its business, which may give you a sense for how a company, whether it's private or state-owned, might be willing to comply with regulatory pressure in order to remain solvent. Another might be the sensitivity of the industry, which can give you a sense for the customers on which it's dependent, and also the extent to which party state regulators are focused with specific goals on the industry. So I'll point people to the report, I think, to consider some of those factors. But I think if we focus too much on trying to definitionally or ontologically, consider is a company private or state-owned, we'll sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of focusing on risk in a more broad sense and the steps we can take to mitigate it.
And I guess related to that, and I understand the point you're making of how, and again, Curtis Milhoff and others have done some work on the kind of beyond ownership idea of looking simply at formal ownership to determine whether there's a state linkage or not. Misses the boat. I wonder, just functionally speaking, though, the process you're outlining now, my first thought is the amount of almost resource burden this places on market economy governments to be doing the vetting of this. And so I wanted to get your sense on what does the functional open source data vetting look like? And because if we're moving to a position where we're moving away from thinking that private sector companies are of lower risk because they're not direct proxies of the state, and we're now, you're suggesting that we move into an approach where it doesn't matter the formal ownership structure. We're treating a state-owned or private as a potential proxy for the state based on some of the buckets that you have outlined. That effectively means that all inbound investment would be seen as a potential risk. Thinking about how much strain is already on the kind of CFIUS FIRMA process now, is there a way to scale up analysis on Chinese firms using this publicly available data that doesn't just essentially add another extraordinary data burden or resource crunch on market economies?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so, I think it will inevitably require a shift of resources, but I think that's consistent with what national security priorities are today. And I think by using publicly available information, you can do it in the most low cost and effective way. So Chinese corporate registry documents, to give some context here, those are free to access. Now, you need to be able to figure out a Chinese CAPTCHA that will put a Chinese idiom in there that you got to click through. The website will crash a bunch, and that's truly a pain, but that's a technical issue more than is really a cost or access issue. And once you get those resources, you can identify information about shareholders, directors, previous changes to those companies, and those data sources are also much more easily accessible through other third-party aggregators and can be collected at scale for very low cost. Certainly, significantly lower cost than the use of more exquisite intelligence resources. So I think if we think of the potential costs as well of what we're missing by falling through the cracks right now, I think, there's a clear benefit to directing resources to the really basic and low-hanging fruit of getting those corporate registry documents, as one example, that are available, that can give us information about who is putting money where, and quickly how they relate to known party state enterprises like Seven Sons of National Defense for Research or political institutions. And in our report, I think we go through some really evocative examples where, prominent organized crime figures that appear on joint ventures with state-owned enterprises, or prominent Chinese businessmen who have significant investments in the military-industrial complex, who are on public political institutions, are in the United States lobbying in the course of elections. They seem like really low-hanging fruit that if we can just connect the dots with stuff that's free on the internet, we can make significant gains that will shore up our democratic values and our national interests. And it's an investment worth making, and significantly less than what we're already spending on more exquisite technical resources. But I think to your more immediate question, it will certainly require investment, and I think it's an investment worth making.
I'm going to get to some of the questions coming in a second, and I notice a few of these are about the local protectionism, and the work that Jason referenced, and to save Jason the time of summarizing a really fantastic and long paper. The paper to look at here is called Special Deals with Chinese Characteristics, which is it can be found on the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research website. The three co-authors are Bai Chong-un at Tsinghua University, Michael Song, who I think is at Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Chang Tai-xie, who's at University of Chicago. But it's just really a mind-bending paper, and I'm going to have Chang Tai on my podcast in a few weeks to talk about it. Just a lot of fantastic work in that. So recommend folks check that out. Let me go to some of the questions coming in, Jason. So any view on how state capitalism is connected to any of the current sort of ideological policy campaigns coming out of Beijing? I think the view is, things like common prosperity. Do you think this is one where, companies will now be bent to help implement some of these broader, policy campaigns coming out of Beijing, or what precisely is the ways in which companies work on Beijing's behalf?
Sure. Yeah. No. I certainly do think as we've seen over the last summer, particularly in the tech sector, the Chinese government has been very willing to use its regulatory muscle to bend companies, including really high-flying, formerly sort of state-preferred type ventures that have transformed the domestic economy into its will based on its current priorities. But I think what's worth keeping in mind, especially when we're thinking about these national security questions, is the Chinese government has a whole host of incentives and priorities that may have nothing to do with the United States, but because the economy is globalized, may still expose us to the collateral damage or the externalities of those interventions in the domestic economy. So I think, the example of some of these, the antitrust movements in the tech industry in particular, how those may refract with investments overseas, whether that's politically or in how certain investment decisions are made, are important to keep in mind. And the question from my point of view about, or that we take in our paper is less about trying to parse out specifically, whether or not companies are controlled or not by the party state, because I think it's a question that's in some ways unanswerable. But instead trying to figure out the conditions under which the party state can really do a lot to coercively move a company in its preferred direction. And then also to understand where there might be significant international exposure that's worth mitigating. And so I'll just sort of cite William Norris at the University of Texas. He's the one that really, I think, came up with and pushed forward this idea of national security externalities for, otherwise, normal Chinese government involvement in the domestic economic system. And that's sort of where we should focus our attention.
A couple of really good questions have come in on the issue of data reliability and, in a forward-looking sense, the consistency and sustainability of this data being available. And I should just say, in my own from my own perch, I've found that consistent and reliable access to some of this open source information. Some of this is qualitative sort of articles on databases like CNKI is getting pretty touchy. And some of the corporate records, you've mentioned how those databases crash, and that's an understatement. I find my success ratio is pretty low. Once folks really start to scale up in hoovering up this data in ways that work against China's own interest, what's not to keep China from essentially corrupting the data or blocking data's access? One of the things I found is, even now using a VPN, it's getting harder and harder, or it's just less reliable to get access to this. So is setting up a strategy based on access to open source information, sowing the seeds of that open source information becoming harder to find as Beijing reacts to it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So, on the first level, there are certain forms of data that are put in the public domain that China needs in order for its economy to function. So things like corporate registry documents or investment disclosures. The Chinese government also wants that information out there for A, to know what's happening in its own economy, but then B, so that investors can confidently, direct their capital to help the economy grow. And so I think that's a really interesting set of questions in terms of which types of data sets are maybe more resistant to that type of regulatory capture or closure than others, and how that maybe informs what we prioritize for collection in a more sort of, open way, or versus a more sensitive way that, tries to keep it from being exposed and ultimately shut down. The second thing, though, that can't be denied is that China is clearly very capable at controlling the data that comes out, and is making a very concerted effort to make sure that it doesn't. And that includes everything from, as you said, I think probably intentionally making certain sites more difficult to access, but also really raising the stakes for those who might bring data overseas. So we've seen movement in that direction from a policy point of view in the last many months, which I know for us as users, the number or things that were much easier to access, there's now all sorts of hoops we have to jump through if we can still get it at all. And when we compare that to maybe other countries like Russia or Iran, there's not as many data brokers out there who are willing to take the risk of reselling stuff that they might have. So it's certainly something to consider. And I think related to that, though, is how we approach open source information. It doesn't necessarily need to be one organization to go and get it all. There will always be different government entities or civil society organizations or partners across our allies who have different pieces of that puzzle. And so I think a fundamental component of thinking about open source is not only the amount of data that's out there in the public domain, but also how it broadens the community of stakeholders who you can engage to put that puzzle together. And so even as some of those trend lines might make certain data sets come offline and give rise to new ones over time, we can be thinking in a more sort of coordinated fashion about how we collectively can put those pieces together to get the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, especially because these threats are transnational. It's not necessarily just a China thing. You have networks that will span into Canada before the investment comes into the US. And so we can also leverage data domestically in a way that forces some transparency and disclosure that we need to fill gaps that may arise from changes in the Chinese data environment.
Another question that came in is just trying to understand how much insight Beijing has into China's state capitalist system. I think the eye-popping statistic, which I always quote, and you did as well, because it captures a lot of this, is the enduring nature of the conglomerate model in East Asian capitalism, but certainly in China's case. So the statistic about the number of companies, subsidiaries under the top 100 groups moving from 500 to now 15,000. One of the reasons that the U.S. Moved away from a conglomerate model is that for central headquarters, it was very difficult to keep track of everything that was going on when you have this sprawling empire. So I think a question is, if we're positioning this as these enterprises potentially have connectivities into Beijing, is it reasonable to assume that Beijing knows what's going on? If we're thinking about, if we were to just take then, if the average number of subsidiaries in the top 100 companies is 15,000, 15,000 times 100 is 1.5 million. How could Beijing know what's going on? And actually, I think a related question is just take a central holding company for a big SOE like Costco, or you mentioned Polygroup. Does the holding company have any idea what's going on? So does this information dilemma complicate the idea that Beijing is really directing or controlling these entities, given that I don't know what Xi Jinping's sort of what his man cave looks like, but does he have the ability to see all of these firms and kind of move them around the global map?
Yeah, no, I think there's absolutely limits to how much they know and could know, given the complexity and the depth. That's one of the reasons that I think that things like the corporate registry information are going to be enduring to a certain extent, because it's the only way that China itself can get a handle on, how all of this stuff is going on. And so I would also agree with you entirely that I think that given this complexity and that information gap is a key reason why, these assertions that every company is a CCP instrument or anything close to that really take it too far. But I think what's also important to keep in mind with that is that there's an extent to which that doesn't necessarily matter in a system where there's such a lack of informal market protections, where if the government, whether that's Beijing or maybe a provincial government, who knows, really wants to intervene for any number of reasons, it can have a disruptive effect. And maybe that was contained locally within the Chinese domestic economy many decades ago, but as we're increasingly integrated internationally, we have to be able to parse through that and prepare for the ways in which we might be exposed to national security risk, even in the absence of directed CCP operations, because there's any other number of political economic reasons why regulatory intervention or legal intervention could inevitably create a national security risk in the United States. I think what I've been frustrated a bit, and it was a key motivation for writing this report as well, is some of the discourse, I think, around national security risk in China's commercial sector, overstating the involvement of the CCP and getting too focused on, to go back to an earlier question about the distinction between state-owned versus private, as if that would clear a company from being a potential national security problem. And it gets fundamentally to this question that you're describing now about information gap, but also, to what extent that might not matter in a system that has such a prominent set of extra legal mechanisms through which governance and the economy is organized.
You've done now you've been spending a lot of time looking at the kind of functional realities of China's political economy, including, integration of party cells, industrial policy. I'm curious, there's a discussion now bubbling up here about our own version of industrial policy. Is there anything you think we can learn from how China operates? I mean, we think of this as a pure negative, but I'm curious, China seems to be on the balls of its feet in terms of innovating on industrial policy. You mentioned government guidance funds, which are kind of channeled markets. Anything that you've looked at that you thought is something we should consider ourselves?
That's a really interesting question, one I've not spent as much time thinking about as I know many have, so I will defer to their esteemed opinions. But maybe I'll point to some interesting things I have seen in the course of this research that maybe weren't on people's radars. So one of the many ways in which the Chinese government has sought to incentivize academics to commercialize technology domestically is by creating a whole bunch of financial inducements. So for those who don't know, China has an obscene amount of patents globally, but really struggles to bring stuff out of the lab. If it gets overseas to the lab, how does it get to market? That's where it kind of breaks down. And so it's really important to get professors to start these ventures and really work on that. One of those mechanisms has, in addition to sovereign wealth funds and holding companies injecting capital into startups, is also the ability for professors to secure equity in startups by surrendering rights of the patents that they've created. And as we've seen in the case of Ponzi and Wei and some of these quantum startups, those can ultimately become extremely valuable, especially if that state-preferred firm, through any number of protectionist type policies, gets it to IPO on some of these domestic stock exchanges. And so, the use of patents and other sort of academic, traditionally sort of academic and research-based items to secure some of this equity stakes is an interesting one that we've seen, and I think we'll want to research further. But anyway, on the much bigger question of what we can learn from industrial policy to implement ourselves, I will defer to the folks who have thought significantly more about that and how I'm able to apply it.
Well, I thought you were going to say we need Republican Party cells operating in U.S. companies to make sure we're implementing policy. We're right at time, and so Jason, want to thank you. This has been a great discussion, and can't recommend enough the report that you did. And what I also really appreciate the report, as folks can tell from Jason's presentation, is it's drawing on the current academic research out there by folks like Meg Rithmeyer at Harvard Business School or Chong Tai-Hsieh at University of Chicago. There's just some really interesting work going on in helping us understand the current evolutions of state capitalism or party state capitalism or party capital or whatever label we're going to finally arrive at. So appreciate you incorporating that, and also just appreciate how you've really, I think, set the standard and moved, if I'll mix my metaphor, set the standard and moved the ball forward in what really good strategic granular thinking looks like that's policy relevant. So highly recommend folks go over to the C4ADS website and download the report. And Jason, just want to thank you again for the report and for your time this morning.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Jude.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.